The date is March 1964. The location is a windowless concrete bunker buried deep beneath the birch forests outside Moscow. Usually, the atmosphere here is one of disciplined tension, but tonight it is chaos. A senior general stands on the balcony overlooking the plot board. His knuckles are white as he grips the railing. He is watching a simulation, a war game designed to test the absolute limits of the Soviet Union's defensive network. But the data being fed into the simulation is not theoretical. It is based on a new stream of intelligence reports that have just arrived from the United States. On the radar scopes, a single blip appears. It is designated Target Alpha. The radar operators, seasoned men who have tracked American B-52 bombers and U-2 spy aircraft for years, stare at their screens in confusion. The blip is moving, but it is moving wrong. It defies the physics they have been taught. A standard American bomber, a B-52 Stratofortress, crawls across the scope at subsonic speeds. It is a lumbering beast, easy to track, easy to calculate an intercept vector for. Even the faster B-58 Hustler, which can dash at supersonic speeds, has a predictable energy bleed. Target Alpha is different. It enters the tracking zone at 70,000 feet. That altitude alone is terrifying. It is the domain of spy aircraft, the thin edge of the atmosphere where the air is so thin that conventional wings struggle to find purchase. But it is the speed that causes the lead radar officer to tap his glass, certain that the equipment has malfunctioned. The blip is traveling at 3,200 kilometers per hour. Mach 3. Check the calibration, the general barks from the balcony. The target is simulating a ballistic missile trajectory. Negative, Comrade General. The operator's voice cracks, trembling slightly. The target is maneuvering. It is changing heading. It is under pilot control. It is not a missile. Silence descends on the command bunker. A silence so heavy it feels like the concrete ceiling is pressing down on their chests. A vehicle that flies as high as a spy plane, moves as fast as a missile, but carries the payload of a heavy bomber. The simulation continues. The general orders his interceptors to scramble. On the board, markers representing the Soviet Union's most advanced fighters, the Su-9 and the early MiG-21 aircraft race to intercept. It is a massacre. The interceptors climb with afterburners roaring, burning fuel at a catastrophic rate just to reach the thin air. By the time they reach their combat ceiling, they are sluggish, their engines gasping for oxygen. Target Alpha simply powers up. It does not turn to fight. It does not deploy decoys. It simply accelerates. It outruns the interceptors as if they were standing still. The Soviet pilots scream into their radios that they cannot get a lock, that the target is leaving them behind. Next, the general orders the surface-to-air missiles. The SA-2 guideline batteries, the pride of the Soviet defense industry, the same missiles that brought down Francis Gary Powers. The simulation fires a salvo, but the geometry is impossible. The target is moving so fast that by the time the missile radar locks on and the missile leaves the rail, the target has already crossed the sky. The missiles chase a ghost, exploding miles behind the tail of the intruder. The simulation ends. The plot board shows a clean, uninterrupted red line cutting straight across the heart of Mother Russia, from the Arctic coast all the way to the industrial centers of the Urals. Target Alpha has delivered its payload, a technician whispers. Moscow is gone. The general turns away from the board, his face ashen. This was a simulation, yes, but the numbers were real. The Americans were building something. Something that made the entire Soviet defense network billions of rubles, thousands of radar stations, regiments of interceptor aircraft obsolete overnight. They were building a ghost that could fly faster than a rifle bullet and burn the world to ash before the Kremlin could even pick up the red phone. Before we dive deeper into this shadow war and the terrifying machine that sparked it, make sure you are subscribed to our channel, Cold War Impact. We explore the hidden history of the conflicts that shaped our modern world. Hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the truth behind the headlines. The panic that gripped the Soviet high command in the early 1960s was not born of paranoia, it was born of mathematics. To understand the terror in that bunker, you must understand the Soviet mindset of the era. The Soviet Union is a land power, a vast, sprawling empire that spans 11 time zones. Its borders are its greatest vulnerability. Unlike the United States, which is protected by two massive oceans, the Soviet Union is surrounded. To the west, NATO. To the south, American bases in Turkey and the Middle East. To the east, the Pacific Fleet. For 20 years, since the end of the Second World War, the Soviet strategy had been simple. build a wall of iron in the sky. They constructed the densest air defense network in human history. They built radar stations on remote Siberian peaks where temperatures dropped to -60 degrees. They garrisoned hundreds of thousands of men in lonely outposts, watching the screens, waiting for the American bombers. They knew the Americans had the B-52 bombers. They respected the B-52. It was a formidable enemy, carrying a massive nuclear load. But it was a known quantity. The Soviets believed that with enough MiG aircraft and enough missiles, they could bleed the American bomber fleets dry before they reached the cities. They accepted that some would get through, but the motherland would survive. But this new threat, this was an existential nightmare. Intelligence reports coming out of the United States aviation industry were fragmented but consistent. They spoke of a project with unlimited range and unprecedented speed. The Soviet KGB agents in the West were sending back whispers of a white bird, a massive triangular shape that looked more like a spaceship than an airplane. They heard rumors of exotic materials, stainless steel honeycomb, titanium alloys materials that the Soviet industry struggled to produce in quantity. The stakes could not have been higher. If the Americans possessed a fleet of these Mark III bombers, the concept of mutually assured destruction was broken. Deterrence relies on the idea that if you strike me, I will strike you back. But if the enemy has a weapon that you cannot see until it is too late, and cannot stop even if you do see it, you have no deterrence. You are defenseless. You are at the mercy of their goodwill. And the men in the Kremlin, hardened by revolution and war, did not believe in American goodwill. In the weeks following that simulation, a frantic energy took hold of the Soviet military establishment. The realization rippled through the ranks. Their skies were open. The billions of rubles they had poured into the MiG-19 and MiG-21 programs felt like wasted money. These aircraft were designed to fight dogfights or catch subsonic bombers. Against a target moving at 3,200 kilometers per hour, they were little more than spectators. The fear was compounded by a lack of concrete information. They did not have a blueprint. They did not have a flight manual. They only had the physics. And the physics told them they were dead. Consider the sheer scale of the problem. A radar operator sees a blip at 300 kilometers range. If that blip is a B-52 flying at 900 kilometers per hour, the operator has 20 minutes to coordinate an intercept. He can call up the pilots, they can taxi, take off, climb, and vector in. If that blip is flying at 3,200 kilometers per hour, the operator has less than 6 minutes. 6 minutes. In 6 minutes, a pilot cannot even strap into his cockpit and start the engine, let alone climb to the stratosphere. By the time the call goes out, the bomber is already overhead. By the time the missile radar warms up, the bomber is gone. The compression of time was the true enemy. This new American weapon collapsed the decision-making loop of the Soviet military into a singularity of failure. The general in the bunker knew this. He looked at the clean red line on the plot board, the path of the ghost bomber. He knew that if this machine became operational, the Soviet Union would cease to be a superpower. It would become a target. He turned to his aides, his voice low and dangerous. "Find out what this is. Find out how they are doing it. And tell me what we need to build to kill it." The hunt for the Phantom had begun, but the Soviets had no idea that they were chasing a shadow that would lead them to brink of their own technological limits, forcing them to build a monster of their own, a monster that the West would one day misunderstand just as badly as the Soviets misunderstood the threat facing them now. The incident was not a battle of metal and fire, it was a battle of the mind. It was the moment the Soviet Union looked into the mirror of its own defenses and saw nothing but a gaping hole. And in the darkness of that hole, something terrified them. What exactly was this Target Alpha? How had the Americans managed to defy the heat barrier that melted aluminum and cooked pilots alive? And why were the Soviet scientists, usually so confident in their robust designs, suddenly trembling at the equations on their chalkboards? The mystery was about to deepen. As the KGB mobilized its networks and the best minds of the Soviet aerospace bureaus were summoned to Moscow, the question wasn't just, how do we stop it? It was, is it even possible to stop it? The panic that started in the radar bunker did not stay underground. It rose like a toxic gas, seeping into the halls of the Kremlin and the locked offices of the Soviet design bureaus. The order came down from the highest levels of the Communist Party. Identify the threat, quantify it, kill it. This kicked off one of the most intense intelligence operations of the Cold War. The KGB, the GRU, and military attachés stationed in Washington were all given a single priority directive. They were hunting for a ghost that the Americans called the Valkyrie. At the Mikoyan Gurevich Design Bureau, the legendary home of the MiG fighters, the atmosphere was frantic. The chief designers were summoned to meetings that lasted until dawn. They were presented with the intelligence dossiers that the KGB had managed to assemble. What they saw in those folders terrified them. It wasn't just secret documents stolen from safes. The Americans, in their arrogance or perhaps as a psychological tactic, were parading their ambition in public. The Soviet analysts pored over issues of Aviation Week and Space Technology, a magazine so filled with technical details that the Soviets jokingly called it Aviation Leak. They found artist concepts and grainy telephoto shots of a machine that looked like it had flown out of a science fiction novel. It was white, stark, and enormous. It had a long, cobra-like neck and a massive delta wing. But it was the details that kept the Soviet engineers awake at night. The reports claimed this aircraft, the B-70, would not just dash to Mach 3, it would cruise at Mach 3. This distinction is critical. Most supersonic aircraft of the 1960s, like the American F-4 Phantom or the Soviet MiG-21 aircraft, could only break the sound barrier for a few minutes. They had to use afterburners, dumping raw fuel into the exhaust. It was inefficient and brutal on the engines. After a short sprint, they would run out of fuel. But the intelligence on the Valkyrie suggested something impossible. Compression lift. The American engineers claimed they were riding their own shockwave. The shape of the Valkyrie was designed to trap the supersonic shockwave under its wing, using the high pressure to push the aircraft up. It was like a surfer riding a wave. This meant the bomber could stay at 3,200 kilometers per hour for thousands of miles, crossing oceans without refueling, all while flying higher than any Soviet fighter could climb. The Soviet engineers looked at their own blueprints and despaired. They knew the heat barrier was the ultimate limit. When an object moves through air at Mach 3, the friction is violent. The air molecules cannot get out of the way fast enough. They compress and heat up. The nose of the aircraft reaches 330 degrees Celsius. The leading edges of the wings glow. At these temperatures, standard aviation aluminum, the material used for every Soviet fighter, loses its strength. It softens. It warps. An aluminum plane flying at that speed would literally tear itself apart in mid-air. The Soviet metallurgists were baffled. How are they doing it? They asked in the smoke-filled conference rooms. Are they building the entire plane out of titanium? At the time, titanium was incredibly difficult to work with. It was brittle, hard to weld, and astronomically expensive. The Soviet Union had plenty of titanium ore, but the industrial process to shape it into thin aircraft skin was still in its infancy. If the Americans were building a fleet of hundreds of massive bombers entirely out of titanium and stainless steel honeycomb, it meant their industrial base was decades ahead of the Soviet Union. The bogeyman grew larger with every intelligence briefing. Rumors swirled that the Valkyrie wasn't just a bomber. The KGB intercepted chatter suggesting it could carry air-launched ballistic missiles. Imagine a launcher moving at Mach 3 at 70,000 feet. It could release a nuclear missile that would already have massive kinetic energy. The reaction time for Moscow would be reduced from 15 minutes to 0. The paranoia was fueled by the silence of the American military. The US Air Force wasn't denying the rumors. They were letting them fester. They announced they would buy hundreds of these bombers. They would replace the B-52 fleet entirely. In the Soviet mind, this wasn't just a new weapon, it was a checkmate. The psychological impact on the Soviet pilots was profound. These were brave men, trained to defend the motherland against any intruder. But how do you ask a man to fight a god? The pilots of the PVO Strany sat in their ready rooms, looking at the capabilities of their Su-9 interceptors. They knew the math. If a Valkyrie flew over the Soviet Union, a Soviet pilot in a Su-9 would have to perform a snap-up attack. He would have to accelerate to his maximum speed, pull the nose up violently, and try to launch a missile blindly into the stratosphere, hoping the seeker head could find the target before his own aircraft stalled and fell out of the sky. The probability of kill was calculated to be less than 5%. And that was for one bomber? If the Americans sent a wing of 50 Valkyries, it would be a parade. The investigation turned inward. The Soviet leadership demanded to know why their own scientists hadn't invented compression lift. Why hadn't they solved the sustained Mach 3 problem? Accusations of incompetence began to fly. Careers were on the line. In the Soviet system, failure was not just a professional setback, it could be a ticket to a labor camp. The pressure cooker of the Kremlin forced a desperate conclusion. They could not match the American technology. They could not build a better bomber, not yet. The Soviet economy couldn't support the massive cost of a titanium fleet. So, they decided to do the only thing they could do. If they couldn't outfly the Valkyrie, they had to build a brute force counterweapon. A weapon so fast, so powerful, and so extreme that it didn't need to be sophisticated. It just needed to be fast enough to catch the Ghost. The order went to Artem Mikoyan. "Build us an interceptor?" the generals demanded. "It does not need to turn, it does not need to dogfight, it needs to be a manned missile. It must reach Mach 3. It must carry the largest radar ever put on a fighter. And it must carry missiles big enough to blow the Valkyrie out of the sky." This was the birth of the Project E-155, the machine that the world would come to know as the MiG-25. But as the Soviet engineers began to sketch the lines of this new beast, struggling with their own heat problems, using stainless steel instead of titanium because they couldn't master the welding, they remained haunted by the image of the American bomber. They imagined the Valkyrie pilots sitting in air-conditioned cockpits, cruising comfortably at the edge of space, looking down on the struggling Soviet interceptors with disdain. The Soviets were building their countermeasure out of fear, rushing a heavy, clunky iron beast into production to stop a sleek silver arrow. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that on the other side of the world, in the high deserts of California, the American dream of the Valkyrie was facing its own nightmare. The Soviet investigation had been too successful. They had believed the marketing, they had believed the hype, they had convinced themselves that the Americans were 10 feet tall. While the KGB was stealing secrets and the MiG Bureau was burning the midnight oil, the reality of the Valkyrie project was far more complicated than the invincible juggernaut the Soviets imagined. The investigation had found the what, a Mark III bomber, but it had missed the why and the how, and that missing context was about to lead the Soviet Union into a trap of their own, making a trap that would result in one of the most misunderstood and fearsome aircraft of the Cold War. But before we reveal the cracks in the American armor, we must cross the ocean. We must leave the frantic halls of the Kremlin and travel to the sun-baked hangars of North American aviation. Here, the target Alpha was real. It was breathing. And it was unlike anything humanity had ever built before. While the generals in Moscow were chasing ghosts on their radar screens, thousands of miles away, under the relentless sun of the Mojave Desert, the Ghost was becoming real. The location was Plant 42 in Palmdale, California. Inside a hangar so large it had its own weather patterns, North American aviation was assembling the future. This was the source of the Soviet nightmare, the XB-70 Valkyrie. To understand why this machine terrified the Kremlin, you have to look at it not as an airplane, but as a monument to pure, unadulterated American ambition. It was huge. It was over 180 feet long, longer than many warships of the era. It stood 30 feet high at the tail, and it was painted a brilliant, anti-flash white, designed to reflect the thermal pulse of a nuclear explosion. It looked like a swan made of razor blades. The engineers at North American Aviation were not just building a better bomber, they were rewriting the laws of aerodynamics. They were solving the very problem that had baffled the Soviet scientists. How do you keep a heavy object in the air at 3 times the speed of sound without burning up all your fuel? The solution was a stroke of genius called compression lift. Imagine a speedboat cutting through the water. It creates a wake, a wave that rises up on either side. Now, imagine if the boat could climb up onto its own wave and ride it like a surfboard. That is what the XB-70 did with air. At Mach 3, the air in front of the plane is compressed into a violent shockwave. Most planes fight this shockwave. It causes drag. The Valkyrie trapped it. The XB-70 had massive wingtips that were hinged. Once the bomber reached supersonic speeds, the pilots would rotate these wingtips down 65 degrees. This created a tunnel under the wing, trapping the high-pressure shockwave. The plane literally sat on top of its own sonic boom. It provided 30% extra lift with 0 drag penalty. It was free energy. This allowed the Valkyrie to do the impossible. It could cruise at 70,000 feet at Mach 3 for hours. It didn't just sprint, it marathon, ran at the speed of a rifle bullet. But the aerodynamics were only half the miracle. The real triumph was the skin. The Soviet engineers were right to worry about the heat. At Mach 3, the friction of the air turns the skin of the aircraft into an oven, reaching temperatures of 600 degrees Fahrenheit, over 300 degrees Celsius. At that heat, an aluminum airframe would soften like butter. So, The Americans didn't use aluminum, they used steel. But a plane made of solid steel would be too heavy to fly. The solution was the stainless steel honeycomb. The engineers took thin sheets of high-grade stainless steel and formed them into a honeycomb pattern, like the inside of a beehive. Then, they sandwiched this honeycomb between two paper-thin sheets of steel. The result was a material that was incredibly light, incredibly strong, and could withstand the fires of hell. It was a manufacturing nightmare. It required a level of precision that didn't exist yet. The engineers had to invent new welding techniques, new brazing ovens, and new quality control methods just to build the panels. Every square inch of the aircraft was a prototype. Under the massive delta wing sat the beating heart of the beast. 6 General Electric YJ-93 turbojet engines. Lined up side by side, they produced a combined thrust of over 170,000 pounds. When they were lit, they didn't just push the plane. They shoved the atmosphere out of the way. The XB-70 was intended to be the ultimate weapon of the Strategic Air Command. The plan was audacious, a fleet of these white giants on constant alert, capable of outrunning any Soviet fighter and flying higher than any Soviet missile. It was the silver bullet that would ensure American dominance for the next 20 years. The pilots who flew it, men like Al White and Joe Cotton, described it as riding a wild animal. It was loud, it was complex, and it was fast. So fast that the navigation systems of the 1960s struggled to keep up with the map moving beneath them. From the outside, the program looked unstoppable. The first prototype, Air Vehicle 1, rolled out of the hangar in 1964. It was a moment of supreme technological confidence. The United States had built a machine that made every other aircraft on Earth look like an antique. This was the peak of the gap. The Soviets saw the XB-70 and believed they were looking at the end of their nation. They saw a technological chasm that they could never cross. But there is a tragedy inherent in cutting-edge engineering. When you push the boundaries of what is possible, you are walking a tightrope. The Soviets were looking at the Valkyrie and seeing a Death Star. But the American accountants and strategists were starting to see something else. They saw a money pit. They saw a dinosaur. While the engineering was flawless, the premise was flawed. The Valkyrie was built to fight a war that was already changing. It was designed to fly high and fast because, in the 1950s, high and fast meant safe. But in the 1960s, the rules of the game were being rewritten by the very missiles the Soviets were desperately developing. The irony was palpable. The Soviets were building the MiG-25 to kill the Valkyrie. The Valkyrie was built to kill the Soviets. But neither side realized that the true enemy of the Valkyrie wasn't a Soviet missile. It was a shift in strategy, a change in the wind of geopolitics, and a tragic accident that was waiting in the wings. The Americans had built the perfect sword for a duel that would never happen. As the Valkyrie took to the skies, roaring over the California desert, tearing the sky apart with its sonic boom, it was majestic. It was the apex of the jet age. But the shadow it cast was about to fade. The Soviets were about to have their shock moment. But it wouldn't come from a nuclear strike. It would come from the realization that they had panicked over a ghost that was already dying. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not a clash of titanium and fire in the stratosphere. It was a confrontation with reality. By 1965, the Soviet intelligence machine was running at full capacity. They had the MiG-25 prototypes, known as the Ye-155, screaming across the testing ranges at Akhtubinsk. They were breaking world records. They had built the fastest interceptor on the planet. They had managed to wield heavy stainless steel into a shape that could pierce the sound barrier. They felt ready. But then, the reports from Washington changed. At first, the Soviet analysts in the Kremlin couldn't believe what they were translating. The news was coming from open sources, American newspapers, and congressional budget hearings. The United States Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, was making a strange argument. He was telling the US Congress that the XB-70 Valkyrie was a waste of money. The Soviets were stunned. A waste of money? How could the ultimate weapon, the machine that rendered the entire Soviet air defense network obsolete, be a waste of money? The shock moment for the Soviet High Command wasn't a sudden ambush. It was a slow, creeping realization that the ground had shifted beneath their feet. The Americans weren't cancelling the Valkyrie because it didn't work. The flight data from the prototypes proved it worked beautifully. It flew at Mach 3. It rode its own shockwave. It was a technical marvel. They were cancelling it because they didn't need it. This was the terrifying truth that the Soviet marshals had to swallow. The United States had advanced so far, so fast, that they had leaped over the era of the supersonic bomber entirely. They had developed the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, the ICBM. Specifically, the Minuteman missile. Why risk a pilot and $100 million bomber to drop a nuke when you can launch a missile from a silo in North Dakota that will hit Moscow in 30 minutes with mathematical precision? The Valkyrie was a dinosaur before it was even born. But there was a second layer to this realization, one that was even more bitter for the Soviet leadership. The Americans had looked at the new Soviet surface-to-air missiles, the very SA-2 seconds that the Soviets were so proud of, and decided that high-altitude bombing was suicide. They admitted that the Soviet defenses were too good. This should have been a victory for the Soviets. We deterred them, the generals could have claimed. But in the twisted logic of the Cold War, it was a disaster. The Soviet military-industrial complex had already committed everything to the countermeasure. They had spent billions of rubles developing the MiG-25. They had built entire factories to process the steel. They had trained regiments of pilots. They had built a massive hammer to crush a specific spider. And now, the spider was gone. The Valkyrie program was reduced to just 2 aircraft, redesignated for research purposes only. Then, in June 1966, tragedy struck. One of the 2 Valkyries was involved in a mid-air collision with a chase plane during a photo shoot. The white giant crashed into the desert floor, killing the pilot, Joe Walker, and the co-pilot of the bomber, Carl Cross. The threat was physically destroyed. The program was dead. The Soviets were left standing in the ring, gloves raised, adrenaline pumping, with no opponent. This led to the futile response. A rational nation might have cancelled the MiG-25. If there is no Mark III bomber to intercept, why do you need a Mark III interceptor that handles like a brick and guzzles fuel like a rocket? But the Soviet Union was not a rational system, it was a bureaucratic machine. The momentum of the MiG-25 program was too great to stop. The factory managers needed to meet their quotas. The designers needed their awards. The generals needed their new toys. And deep down, a paranoia remained. What if the Americans are lying? What if they build it anyway? What about the SR-70, one Blackbird? So, they pressed the go button. The MiG-25 entered full production. But now, the flaws of this panic build became glaringly obvious. Without a high-altitude bomber to attack, the MiG-25 was a weapon without a purpose. It was designed for one thing: to fly in a straight line, very fast, climb to high altitude, and fire a massive missile. It was useless in a dogfight. It couldn't turn. If the pilot pulled more than 4.5 Gs, the wings would warp or snap off. And then there were the engines. The massive Tumansky R-15 engines were powerful, yes. They were essentially cruise missile engines strapped to a cockpit, but they were crude. To reach Mach 3, the pilots were forbidden from exceeding Mach 2.8 in normal operations. If they pushed the throttle to full afterburner to reach Mach 3.2, the speed needed to catch the Valkyrie, the engines would literally consume themselves. The suction was so great, it would pull the fuel pumps apart. After a single high-speed flight, the engines would have to be scrapped and replaced. The Americans had built a thoroughbred racehorse in the Valkyrie. The Soviets had built a disposable rocket with a man inside. The ultimate irony came when the MiG-25 was finally revealed to the world. In 1967, at the Domodedovo Air Show, 4 MiG-25 aircraft roared over the crowd. The announcer proudly declared that this aircraft could fly at 3,000 kilometers per hour. The West was terrified. American military analysts looked at the photos of the MiG-25, the huge wings, the massive intakes, and they panicked. They assumed it was a highly agile air superiority fighter. They didn't know it was made of heavy steel. They didn't know it had a vacuum tube radar that was powerful enough to kill rabbits on the runway at 1 kilometer, but lacked the processing power to track low-flying targets. The West thought the MiG-25 was the super fighter. In response, the US hurried to build the F-15 Eagle, a truly maneuverable, advanced fighter to counter it. The Soviets' futile response had created a self-fulfilling prophecy. By building a flawed counter to a dead bomber, they tricked the Americans into building a real super fighter that would dominate the skies for the next 40 years. The Soviets had built a trap for the Valkyrie, but the Valkyrie never came. Instead, they caught themselves. As the 1970s dawned, the Soviet Air Force was stuck with hundreds of these expensive, specialized interceptors. They sat on runways from Murmansk to Vladivostok, engines cold, waiting for a white ghost that had already been scrapped in a California scrapyard. The mystery of Target Alpha had been solved. But the cost of the solution was a fleet of aircraft that were technological dead ends, a symbol of an economy that could imitate and react, but could not innovate its way out of a strategic corner. The final verdict on this shadow war was not delivered on a battlefield in Europe, but on a quiet runway in Hakodate, Japan, on September 6, 1976. A Soviet pilot named Viktor Belenko defected. He flew his top-secret MiG-25 Foxbat low over the sea, dodging radar, and landed on Japanese soil. He climbed out of the cockpit, fired a warning shot from his pistol to keep curious locals away, and waited for the Americans. For the Western intelligence agencies, this was Christmas morning. They finally had the monster in their hands. They took the aircraft apart, piece by piece. And what they found inside stunned them for a completely different reason than they expected. They were looking for a super fighter. They found a flying steam engine. They found that the skin was not exotic titanium, but hand-welded steel. It was heavy and crude. The rivets were not flush. They were rough. And when they opened the avionics bay to look at the legendary radar, they didn't find advanced microchips. They found vacuum tubes, the size of light bulbs. The Western engineers laughed. Vacuum tubes in 1976? It was archaic. It was technology from the 1950s. But then the laughter died down as the realization hit them. The Soviets had built a Mark III interceptor using the technological equivalent of stone knives. It was a masterpiece of brute force engineering. It was a testament to Soviet will, but also a damning indictment of Soviet weakness. They had pushed their industrial base to the absolute breaking point just to achieve parity with an American bomber that had been designed a decade earlier and then cancelled. This leads us to the killer statistic, the number that truly defines the outcome of this rivalry. Because the Americans had been so terrified of the MiG-25, before they knew it was crude, they panicked and built the F-15 Eagle. They poured unlimited budget into the F-15, demanding it be fast enough to catch a Foxbat but agile enough to kill anything else. The result? The F-15 Eagle has an air-to-air combat record of 104 wins and 0 losses. 104-0. The Soviet attempt to counter the Valkyrie didn't just produce a flawed interceptor in the MiG-25. It frightened the Americans into creating the most dominant air superiority fighter in history. The Soviets inadvertently armed their enemy with the very weapon that would dismantle their air forces in the Bekaa Valley, in Iraq, and over the Balkans for decades to come. This brings us to the macro theme of the Cold War. It wasn't just a contest of who had the biggest bomb, it was a contest of economic efficiency. The XB-70 Valkyrie project cost the United States about $1.5 billion. That is a lot of money. But the Soviet response, the development of the MiG-25, the retooling of factories, the training of pilots, the maintenance of a massive fleet of fuel-hungry interceptors cost the Soviet Union vastly more in terms of percentage of their GDP. This is a concept known as virtual attrition. The Americans didn't need to fly the Valkyrie over Moscow to damage the Soviet Union. They just had to build the prototype. The mere existence of the threat forced the Soviets to bleed their economy dry trying to defend against it. The Valkyrie defeated the Soviet Union without ever dropping a single bomb. It forced them to invest in a dead-end technology, high-speed interception, while the Americans quietly pivoted to the real future: stealth. While the Soviets were obsessing over speed, American engineers at Lockheed were already working on the blueprints for the F-117 Nighthawk. They realized that going Mach 3 was loud and hot. Being invisible was better. By the time the Soviets figured this out, the Cold War was effectively over. The legacy of the XB-70 Valkyrie is unique in the history of warfare. Usually, a failed project is forgotten. The Valkyrie was a failure. It never entered service. It was cancelled, and it crashed. Yet, it is perhaps the most influential aircraft of the jet age. It forced the enemy to reveal their hand. It exposed the limitations of the Soviet command economy, which could produce quantity but struggled with the sophisticated quality of the West. It showed that the Soviets were reactive, always chasing the American tail, always fighting the last war. Today, only one XB-70 Valkyrie remains. It rests in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. If you stand next to it, the sheer size is overwhelming. It looks like a creature from another planet, or perhaps a visitor from a future that never happened. The white paint still gleams. The massive delta wing still looks ready to ride the shockwave. It looks fast, even when it is bolted to the concrete floor. It is a beautiful, tragic, terrifying monument to a time when humanity tried to fly faster than the Sunday. The Soviets looked at this machine and saw the end of their world. They were right, but not in the way they thought. The Valkyrie didn't destroy them with nuclear fire. It destroyed them by making them chase a shadow, running them into the ground while the United States simply moved on to the next game. In the end, the radar screens in that concrete bunker in 1964 were not showing a bomber, they were showing a bait, and the Soviet Union swallowed it whole.